I've been a freelance land survivor for about 15 years. Most of my work is sole workout in remote places. I'm usually camping out for days at a time spots where nobody else goes. I actually like it that way, or at least I used to. This happened about 4 years ago. I'd been hired to check boundary markers on a piece of land up in the mountains near the Clearwater region in Idaho. Remote doesn't even come close to describing it. It took 6 miles of hiking just to reach the spot where I set up camp. I told the local ranger station my route, like I always do, and I packed enough supplies for a week. The first day went fine. I found three markers, wrote everything down, and got back to camp before dark. The forecast said it would be cold with light snow, and that's pretty much what happened. But by the second day, things started to change. We got a lot more snow than expected. The next marker was only about a mile out of my way. So instead of stopping right then, I thought, why not? That was a mistake. I still think about how dumb it was not to just stay put or head out of the woods while I had the chance. The ground was covered in hidden rocks and icy slopes under fresh snow. In other words, the worst possible conditions for hiking. I was making my way down a small slope when my boot hit a patch of ice. I never even saw it. One wrong step like that, and you could die. And I mean that for real. I slid about 15 feet before I caught myself on a tree root. I was lucky I didn't slide further, but the pain in my right ankle hit right away. I told myself I was fine, but the second I stood, I groaned out loud from the pain. I couldn't put much weight on that leg, and I knew it would take hours before I could walk normally again. I was so mad at myself, but there was nothing I could do. I gave up on the rest of the walk right there. No marker was worth getting stuck over. I leaned my way back up to the main trail and started the slow walk back to camp. But after a few minutes, I noticed boot tracks on the trail. They looked like they came from deeper in the woods. Off to my left, they were heading the same way I was, and they looked pretty fresh. I could tell by how sharp the edges were, even with the snow falling. I figured it was probably a hunter or maybe someone from the landowner's crew checking the property. It's not unusual to run into people out there, even in remote spots. I didn't think much of it. I just kept moving, trying to keep as much weight off my ankle as I could. As it started getting dark, I began hearing sounds behind me. At first, I thought it was just normal forest noise, but the more I listened, the more it sounded like footsteps. I kept turning around to look, but I couldn't see anything. That part of the forest was really thick, though, so if something was following me, there is a good chance I wouldn't have spotted it anyway. I stopped walking and the sound stopped too. Not right away. There was a delay, maybe a second or two, but it stopped. I froze and listened for anything unusual, but there was nothing except wind and snow. I started walking again, and this time the footsteps didn't come back, so I thought I was in the clear. But then, a few minutes later, I heard them again. I kept turning around, but I still couldn't see anything. It was extra scary because I knew I wouldn't be able to run if something was actually after me. That was the worst part. I would have liked to go check it out or scare off whatever animal was following me, but I couldn't move well enough to try. So I just kept going. Then I heard something metallic off to my left. I don't really know how to describe it. Like something lightly hitting a fence post or a piece of metal equipment. It freaked me out because there wasn't supposed to be anything out there but trees. I had no idea what could be making a metal sound like that. The sound must have distracted me because I suddenly realized I hadn't been paying attention to those footprints I noticed earlier. I looked down and they were gone. I spun around, but I couldn't tell where they had turned off or if they would double back. I kept looking to my left, trying to see through the trees to find whatever made that sound. Then my eyes locked into something, and alarm bells went off in my head. There was another set of footprints coming out of the tree line to my left. running alongside mine through the snow. They weren't far away at all, which was the scariest part. Whoever had been ahead of me on the trail was now walking next to me through the trees. At that point, I was so scared I wasn't thinking straight. I should have just kept walking, but instead I called out, asking if anyone was there. No answer. After about 20 seconds of waiting, I knew I had to get out of there, but my ankle was still killing me, so I couldn't move fast. I wanted to run, or at least jog, but I couldn't. I was close to camp though, so I told myself if I just kept moving, I'd be okay. I wasn't hearing footsteps behind me anymore, which was a small relief, but I knew someone was out there, someone who had been ahead of me earlier, which actually made sense with what I was saying. I was almost at my campsite when I heard a heavy branch snap somewhere behind me. That clearly wasn't natural, or I wouldn't even bother mentioning it. I didn't stop moving. I just kept telling myself that if I made it back, I'd be fine. And eventually, I did reach my campsite. It was fully dark by then. Only after I got inside my tent did it hit me. I wasn't say safer in there than I'd been out on the trail. I started packing right away. My messed up foot made it hard to move fast, but I tried my best to hurry. I'd say maybe 60% of how scared I was came from knowing that if there was a fight or a chase, I'd be completely helpless without full use of my leg. Before I finished packing, I heard the thing I'd been dreading the whole time: footsteps right outside my tent. I was terrified, and my mind was racing through every option. The footsteps weren't coming toward the tent, though, they were circling it. There was nothing I could do but wait to see if they'd rush me. The circling went on for what felt like 5 minutes before everything went quiet. I never heard whoever it was walk away, but I didn't care anymore. I was living, person or not. I finished packing and took a deep breath before unzipping the tent and stepping out into the snow. The second I got outside, I looked into the trees and screamed. There was a man standing at the edge of the tree line, staring right at me. He looked really old and sickly, almost like he was dying. He looked disgusting, honestly. I stared back at him, fully expected him to come at me, but he didn't move. I put my hands up and said, I don't want any trouble. He didn't respond. I didn't know what to do. We just stood there staring at each other for a few minutes until he finally said something I still think about. He said, "You are a lucky man." Then he turned and disappeared into the woods. The rest of that night is pretty foggy in my memory, partly from the pain and partly from the shock of what just happened. If that man had wanted to hurt me, he probably could have. My ankle was wrecked, and there was nothing I could have done to stop him. I finished packing and left, not even caring that it was dark out. When I finally got checked out, they told me I'd severely sprained my ankle, and it was a miracle I hadn't made it worse by walking on it. I did report the man in the woods, but I knew nothing would come of it. I didn't take another winter job for almost a year. I still do remote work. It's how I make my living, and I'm good at it. But I don't camp alone on winter jobs anymore. I either bring someone with me or I turn the job down. This is still the scariest thing that's ever happened to me. When I was a junior in high school, there was a girl I thought about all the time. Her name was Sienna Rollins. She had this pull to her that's hard to explain, but I'll try. She was pretty sure, but it was more than that. She had a certain mystery about her that you wouldn't expect from just any pretty girl. She wasn't popular, and I got the feeling that a lot of people, boys and girls both, were more intimidated by her than anything else. She wasn't warm. She didn't smile much, and most people thought she was weird. I didn't think that. I actually found how different she was kind of fascinating. Catching her eye would freeze me up completely, kind of like how your body reacts to a cold room or a sudden gust of wind. She reminded me of snow, honestly, the way a light snowfall can quiet everything around you, even your own thoughts. She had that same kind of quality, but it felt like nobody noticed it but me. Everyone else just thought the way she kept to herself and rarely spoke was arranged. But I always wanted to know what was going on in her head. I read a lot of young adult fantasy books back then, so that probably had something to do with it. I wrote a lot too. I even named a character in a story I was writing, Sienna. I guess you could say I was a little obsessed, but honestly, I just liked the name too. Anyway, I was walking up the stairs one day with my friend George, talking about that same story, when he asked me what the characters were called. So I told him, and of course, right as I said the name Sienna, who comes around the corner but the real Sienna, walking with one of her friends. She gave me a smirk, about the closest thing to a smile you would ever get out of her, and said something like, "Yeah, because you love me," or something. I was mortified, and George started laughing, which made it even worse. She was already walking past me, clearly not planning to keep talking, and I felt my window closing. I don't know what came over me, but right there on the spot, I asked her out. That actually made her stop. She gave me one of her famous cold stares. She didn't even need to say anything. Her eyes said it all. How dare you ask me that? But then she surprised me. She said yes and gave me her number. She said she would text me, then walked off without letting me respond. I was shocked, but that's how I ended up going on a hike with a girl I'd been thinking about for months. The hike wasn't my idea, by the way. None of it was. She planned the whole thing, and I got the feeling I didn't really have a say in any of it. I was fine with that. So fast forward to the weekend, and Sienna's driving us out to a trail she picked. I'd never been there, and neither had anyone I knew. The drive was about 45 minutes, but it felt like 10 because I was so in my head about it. Sienna had her window down, playing music off her phone, stuff I didn't recognize, which honestly tracked. We pulled into a gravel lot at the base of the trail. There were maybe two other cars there. Sienna didn't hesitate at all. She just started walking, and I followed. For the first 20 minutes or so, things were actually great. Sienna was more talkative than I'd ever seen her, which still wasn't a lot, but for her, it was something. She asked about the story I was writing, which was a little embarrassing, but I gave her a rough summary without trying to sound like an idiot. The trail got narrower as we went, and the trees got thicker. We hadn't seen another person since the parking lot. At some point, the trail split into a fork. I asked Sienna which way to go, and she pointed left without even pausing. I asked if she'd been there before, and she said no. That struck me as a little odd, especially since she seemed so sure of everything, but I didn't say anything. The left path was clearly less kept up. I started getting the feeling we were going on the wrong way, but I wasn't going to question her. I must have been I must have been really lost in my own head because at some point I realized I couldn't hear Sienna's footsteps behind me anymore. The trail had gotten so narrow we were walking single file, and I had taken the lead since she'd waved me ahead. But when I turned around to check on her, she wasn't there. The trail behind me was empty. I called out her name, but got nothing back. Confused, I started walking back the way we'd come. I made it all the way to the fork, and she still wasn't there. I figured maybe she'd stopped to use the bathroom without wanting me to notice. That seemed reasonable enough. But I looked around and realized there wasn't even a side trail for her to have gone down. She was just gone. So I decided to try the right fork instead. To my surprise, that side was even more overgrown, and the further I went, the less it felt like an actual trail. I kept calling her name like an idiot, but I didn't know what else to do. I couldn't figure out why she would have left me, so I told myself it had to be some honest mistake. At one point, I heard a branch snap off to my left, deeper in the trees. When I looked over, I saw movement. Something shifted behind one of the thicker trees. I immediately assumed I knew what was going on. It was Sienna messing with me. That would have been totally like her. So I figured I'd turn it around and surprise her first. I crept over to the tree as quietly as I could, and at the last second, jumped over to scare her. But mid yell, I realized it wasn't Sienna, it was a man. I was horrified. I was horrified, but it was too late. I was standing just inches from this tall, middle aged guy who didn't look scared at all. I stumbled back a few steps, and he just stared at me. Before he could say anything, I blurted out something about looking for my friend, which looking back was a completely useless thing to say. He clearly didn't care. He started walking toward me. I turned and headed back toward the trail, trying not to run. Then I heard a second sound, this time from my right. I looked over and saw another person moving through the trees. This second guy wasn't even trying to hide. He was standing right out in the open, watching me, holding what looked like a tree branch in his hand. That's when I started running. The second guy was blocking my path back to the trail, so I just ran through the woods with no real direction, hoping I'd find another way back. As soon as I started running, both of them started chasing me, and they weren't bothering to be quiet about it anymore. I only made it a few seconds before I only made it a few seconds before something grabbed my ankle and I went down. It was the first guy, and he was trying to pin me. I screamed and kicked and somehow managed to get him off me. I scrambled up and kept running, my mouth filling with blood at that point. I don't think they followed after that, but I didn't stick around to check. I ran until I found the trail, then kept running all the way back to the parking lot. Siena's car was still there, but the other two cars were gone. Sienna wasn't anywhere in sight, which freaked me out even more. I started thinking those two men had grabbed her, that she was in danger. I didn't know what to do. I called her phone about 10 times and got nothing. I was about to call the police when she texted me, asking where I'd gone. I was still typing a reply when I looked up and saw her walking out of the trees, completely calm. I yelled at her to hurry, trying to explain what had happened, but she barely reacted. I told her I wasn't joking, but she just seemed annoyed. Either way, we got in the car and left. I told her everything, and she still didn't seem shaken at all, which felt insane to me. That's when I asked her, point blank, where she'd gone. She told me she thought I'd walked ahead without her and that she'd been trying to catch up the whole time. I knew that wasn't true because I'd gone all the way back to the fork. There's no way I would have missed her. That's when it hit me that she might have had something to do with what happened. What exactly, I had no idea. The ride home was the tensest 45 minutes of my life. I kept glancing over at her, wondering how someone who seemed so calm and innocent could be capable of something that cold and cruel. Honestly, the answer was probably yes. She dropped me off at my house. We said goodbye, and then I was alone again, still shaken by the whole thing. I couldn't get past the fact that within minutes of Sienna vanishing, two strangers had shown up in exact way. Two strangers had Two strangers had shown up in the exact stretch of woods she'd led me into. The trail she chose, the fog she picked, and the fact that she'd let me go ahead of her. It felt planned. And then she just reappeared afterward, completely unharmed, asking where I'd gone. We never hung out again after that. I never reached out, and there is no chance she would have reached out to me first. I've told this story to maybe 4 or 5 friends over the years, and the reaction is always the same, that Sienna set me up, that she knew about the trail and the men in the woods. I've thought about that possibility more times than I can count, but I still have no idea why anyone would do that to me. I've no idea where Sienna is now. She's not on any social media, and I have no idea where she ended up going to college. I've lived in Alaska most of my life. My family moved to Fairbanks when I was 6, and I never really left. I spent my summers working fish camps as a teenager, started guiding professionally in my early 20s, and that's basically been my life ever since. I'm 29 now. I work seasonally as a wilderness guide in northern Alaska, and I've been doing it long enough that I don't usually get rattled out there. I didn't think I could get lost, but what happened 3 years ago made me rethink that. My boyfriend at the time was Randy. He grew up in rural British Columbia and was basically the male version of me when it came to the outdoors. Actually, that's not fair to him. He was probably more experienced than me in some areas, like winter navigation especially. We'd been together about 4 years, and most of our relationship was built around trips that would make a normal couple miserable. Week long hunts and backcountry trips where you actually have to plan things out or you could die. That sounds dramatic, but up there, it's literally true. The plan was to snowmobile between two state cabins about 60 miles apart. We'd spend a night at each one and be back home in 4 days. We'd done this exact trip twice before, and it always went fine. The weather forecast looked good when we left, so we weren't worried at all. The first day was completely uneventful. We got to the second cabin by late afternoon, ate some freeze dried meals that Randy swore tasted good but were actually terrible, and played cards. It was a pretty relaxed evening. The next morning, I woke up and realized there was a real storm going on outside. It was basically a full on blizzard that came out of nowhere, which was surprising since the forecast hadn't mentioned any snow at all. Randy and I decided to push through the storm anyway, even though we had plenty of food and could have. The next morning, I woke up and realized there was a real storm going on outside. It was basically a full on blizzard that came out of nowhere, which was surprising since the forecast hadn't mentioned any snow at all. Randy and I decided to push through the storm anyway, even though we had plenty of food and could have easily waited another day. We should have waited. I know that now. Things went bad fast. The wind was almost once. Things went bad fast. The wind was almost worse than the snow. It was hard to see anything. So Randy took the lead. I just followed the path his snowmobile made, which was actually easier than trying to navigate on my own in low visibility. That's part of why I don't blame that's part of why I don't blame him for what happened. I don't really know how it happened. One second Randy was riding along fine, and the next his snowmobile was on top of him. I jumped off mine and ran over, but it was too late. His leg was bent in a way legs aren't supposed to bend. And keep in mind, this was a guy who once finished a 2 day trek on a sprained ankle without even mentioning it until we got back to the truck. The first thing I tried was getting him onto my snowmobile. That seemed like the obvious move. Just get him on the back and ride us both to the cabin. But Randy was 6 feet 2 inches and around 220 pounds at the time. And these aren't like ATVs where you can just throw someone on the back and go. Handling an Arctic cat in deep snow is already a lot for one person. I got him up once, have dragged him onto the seat behind me, and he lasted maybe 10 seconds before sliding off the side. The sound he made when he hit the ground is something I never want to hear again. I tried a second time, and it was even worse. He couldn't grip with his legs at all, and every time the machine shifted even slightly, he'd start sliding, and there was nothing I could do to hold him and steer at the same time. At the second try, he told me to stop, and the way he said it, it wasn't a request, it was an order. That's when we both accepted what the plan was actually going to have to be. I pulled out the satellite phone, and my hands were shaking so badly I almost dropped it. I managed to get a connection after a few tries, but I wasn't sure if my message with our coordinates actually went through. Waiting for someone else to come and save Randy felt like a terrible idea, and we both knew it. I knew what had to happen. I'd leave him sheltered with everything we had, then take my snowmobile and push for the nearest cabin to use the emergency radio. There wasn't much discussion about it. Randy looked at me, I looked at him, and that was it. I got him set up with every extra layer of clothing we had and marked our coordinates on my GPS. He told me to be careful, then told me not to do anything stupid. Then I left him there in the snow. I was navigating mostly by feel and GPS. I was navigating mostly by feel and GPS, and things felt so dire that I was struggling not to panic. After about 45 minutes, something started to feel off, like the landmarks weren't matching up, and the ground didn't look right. I kept telling myself it was just the snow messing with my eyes, but the feeling kept getting worse. Then I saw smoke through the trees to my left. I turned toward it, thinking I'd somehow loop back to one of the cabins, but the building didn't match either one. It was smaller and honestly kind of ugly, with one side almost buried in a snowdrift. There was a faint glow coming from inside, and smoke rising from the chimney. At that point, all I could think was smoke means a person, and a person means a radio, or at least a way to warm up enough to keep going. I shut off the engine and trudged through the snow to the door. I knocked a few times, expecting someone to answer, but no one did. So I tried the handle and found it unlocked. I walked in and was surprised to find it was actually really warm inside. Someone clearly lived there. There was a wood stove in the corner with the fire going, and a bedroll on the floor. There was also a can of food on the floor with a spoon still stuck in it. It looked like whoever lived there had walked out the door just 5 minutes before I showed up. I called out, but no one answered. So I just stood there warming. So I just stood there warming my hands and trying the satellite phone again. Still no luck, which was pretty discouraging. Even so, I didn't want to go back out into those brutal conditions, but I had to. Randy's life depended on it. As I turned to leave, I noticed something on the shelf on the back wall. I walked over and saw it was a pair of binoculars, along with the folded map and a notebook. I opened the map and realized it was a trail map of the exact area we'd been riding through. Sections of it were circled in marker, and I recognized a couple of them. Both of the cabins we'd been staying at were circled, with dates written next to them in pencil. Some were from that winter, some from the winter before, and so on. I picked up the notebook and realized whoever owned it had been keeping notes on people, what they were wearing, what direction they were headed, what they were wearing, what direction they were headed, that kind of thing. I got a sick feeling that Randy and I were probably somewhere in that notebook, but I wasn't about to stick around to check. I can't really explain what it felt like. It wasn't fear right away. It was more like everything in that cabin suddenly rearranged itself in my head. It didn't feel like a safe place anymore. I put everything down and headed straight for the door. But before I could reach the handle, I heard the loudest, most terrifying scream I have ever heard. It came from below me, under the floor. It was a woman, and she wasn't saying any words. just screaming at the top of her lungs like she was being stabbed. The shock made me jump, and I ran for the door. I started my snowmobile as fast as I could and rode out of there without looking back. I never saw that cabin again. I was total mess after that, to the point where I barely remembered the rest of the ride. At some point, I made it to the actual cabin and got through on the emergency radio. They had to send a helicopter just to reach Randy. He was hypothermic and his leg was in bad shape, but he was alive and awake. It was the worst few hours of my life. So bad that I still have trouble piecing together the order of events. Randy survived, but the whole thing was so traumatic that he swore off winter navigation for good, or at least for as long as we were still together.